mode.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar entitled China's ATM Market, Now the World's Biggest, brought to you by Kapronasia. My name is Paul Robinson. I'll be acting as the webinar moderator. The ATM market in China can be representative of other fintech sectors in the country. Facing a less than welcoming stance from regulators and up-and-coming domestic competition, foreign manufacturers, once strongly entrenched with their advanced solutions and strong budgets, are now gradually giving ground. With the number of ATMs peaking at 520,000 units in 2013, surpassing the number of ATMs deployed in the US, China is now the largest ATM market in the world. So understanding current and future progress in this fascinating market is essential for every player considering entry. In this informative 30-minute webinar, we'll look at some of the key insights from Kapronasia's upcoming ATMs in China 2014 report. We'll answer a number of questions, such as who are the main ATM buyers, which ATM market sector has the most rapid growth, why foreign manufacturers are losing their market share to domestic ATM producers, and what VTMs in China are, and how they'll change the industry landscape. Now, I do need to inform you that today's session is being recorded and is run in listen-only mode. However, we really want to encourage feedback and questions from you throughout the webinar. To facilitate this discussion, we're going to use two features of the webinar software. First is the viewer window, where you'll see the presentation, which I recommend maximizing now so you can see it in full screen. And the second, of course, is the control panel, where you can interact with us. This control panel can be opened and closed by clicking on the arrow button on the Grab tab. And in that control panel, you're welcome to submit questions and comments to our presenter. Now, we'll be answering as many of those as possible throughout the presentation, and of course at the conclusion of the webinar too. Now, with all that housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. Our presenter today is Zenon Kaplan, who is Managing Director of Kapronasia. Zenon is joining us from Kapronasia's head office in Shanghai, and is one of Asia's leading providers of independent research, custom consulting, and advisory services focusing on the financial industry and financial technology. Kapronasia helps clients understand and navigate the challenges they face in a challenging region with a rapidly changing business, operational, and technological environment. So let's get the discussion started. Let's hear first from Zenon. Zenon, please go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. And welcome everybody to the webinar today where we'll get into ATMs in China. The webinar will basically be broken down into 5 sections. So first, we're going to go through the industry overview and give you an idea of what's happening overall. Next, we'll go into looking at the ATM purchasers and manufacturers. Section 3, we'll look at the risks and opportunities, then future trends, and we'll give you some conclusions on what's happening with ATMs in China. As Paul mentioned, please ask any questions as we go through, and we'd be happy to answer as many of those as we can during the webinar today. So if we take a look at what's happening in terms of the numbers in China, the number of networked ATMs in China is growing rapidly. We have an average annual growth rate of 20% with an install base that peaked at 520,000 in 2013, which actually surpassed the US. So if you look at the chart below, it shows the growth of ATMs over the past 12 years, starting in 2002, leading up to 2013. Within that time, it definitely peaked around 2008, when we can see that the ATM install base increased to 36%, and going from 2012 to 2013, moderated down to about 25%. Another way to look at the number of ATMs in China is looking at the penetration of ATMs. So the number of ATMs deployed versus the population. Right now, China is looking at about 382 ATMs per million people. And that's up from 307 per million people in 2012. So if you picture that being the number of ATMs over a given population, that would be looking at someplace like Shanghai, where there's 20 million people. The indication here is that about 400 ATMs are available per million people in the city. This actually surpassed the global average level of 346 units for the first time in 2013, but it still lags other developed markets. So the average in Western Europe is 786, and you can see from the chart that in the US it's about 1,400. which means that there's a lot more room to grow in terms of ATM penetration within the market in China. As well, looking at the density, if we look at the average number of payment cards per ATM, so these are debit or credit cards per ATM, in 2013, every ATM served about 8,000 payment cards. So this was a better performance than in 2012. It was 8,500, but it's still below the international average of 4,000, which means that there's still room for growth. So actually, in this case, in the previous cases, the larger numbers indicated a greater penetration, but in this case, it's actually smaller numbers mean a greater penetration, as there's more ATMs for the payment cards that are out there. In terms of the location, geographical dispersion of the ATMs in China, most of the ATMs are located in large, middle-sized cities rather than in small and rural areas. But we'll see that that's an area of growth within China. With the rural banking push from the central government, the number of ATMs that are moving into kind of the west of China and moving away from the more populated, densely populated coastal regions is increasing as the government pushes for on the rural banking reform. So if you look at the ATMs per million citizens in places like Beijing and Shanghai, they're meeting or close to what we saw in the previous slides in terms of Western standards. But in less developed provinces like Sichuan province, there's just over 50 units per million people. So much less penetration and a lot of opportunity in those next tier provinces, so to speak. ATMs in China work pretty much as you would expect, but there are a few differences. When you look at withdrawals, ATMs in China in many cases actually give you cash first and then the card. So if you're used to ATMs in Western markets, you would typically get your card, your receipt, and then your cash. So the cash is the last thing that comes out of the machine. In China, the card is actually the last thing that comes out of the machine in most ATMs, but some ATMs work more on the Western way of card, receipt, and cash. Transfer. Most banks' ATMs can also be used for transferring money either to other bank accounts within the same bank or across bank. And this is kind of unique functionality for the Chinese ATMs. The exception to this is ICBC. And so right now on most of the ICBC ATMs, you can only transfer what they call sub-account, so within ICBC. But in most other banks, you can use, say, Bank of China's ATM, and you can transfer money to somebody who has an account at China Merchants Bank ATM. So this is quite convenient. Often that transfer also ties into mobile phone numbers. So myself as an ICBC card holder, I can put my mobile phone number into the system such that if somebody wants to transfer money to my account, rather than remembering a long 20+ digit account number, all they need to do is have my mobile phone number. They can type that into the ATM, and then that will be routed to my account. In addition, one difference as well is the commission charge. Commission charges in China, even within the same currencies, so we're all talking within renminbi here, you can pay a 1% commission if you're withdrawing from an ATM in a different city. The example that we have here is using ICBC. So if you use an ICBC payment card from Shanghai to withdraw money, say from an ICBC account or ATM in Beijing, you'll pay 1%, which will at least be 1 renminbi. And the maximum of 50 renminbi. So this is quite a bit different. If you think about a Citibank as an example, if you're a Citibank cardholder in the US, whether you withdraw from a Citibank ATM in New York or a Citibank ATM in California, you would expect there would be no fee for that, but that's not the case here. So this is essentially saying that if you're withdrawing from a Citibank in New York, you would pay a fee in California. Whereas cross-bank withdrawals, you would typically expect that. So if you're using your HSBC ATM card to withdraw from, say, a Bank of America ATM, you would expect a fee. But actually, in this case, it's the same bank within the same country that's charging a fee. In addition, there's another tariff for withdrawing from other banks. And so the second point here on the commission charge, that's quite common across most of the banks in China as well. So give you an idea of kind of what's happening within the industry. Now I want to take a look at kind of the purchasers or manufacturers. So basically who's buying ATMs and what are the trends in people selling them. If you look at the ATM buyers, pretty much everybody is buying. nationally owned commercial banks, joint stock banks, postal savings banks, city commercial banks, rural commercial banks, and rural credit cooperatives. Purchasing volume, in terms of purchasing volume, there was kind of a peak in 2012, and then that declined a little bit in 2013. So we saw kind of a rapid expansion leading up to 2012 in terms of the ATMs that are being purchased, and then that scaled back a little bit in 2013. This was likely due to a lot of the competitive pressures that the banks were feeling and the focus on costs. For many years, the Chinese banks didn't have to worry about costs because they were incredibly profitable. And they still are some of the most profitable banks around the world, but they're facing increasing competitive pressures from growing smaller banks and other forms of kind of quasi-banking, like some of the online finance products like Yuebao. So there's a little bit more focused on cost, and that's especially important for any fintech vendors, ATM manufacturers that are focusing on China, because that makes the competitive landscape a little bit more challenging. So we would expect the numbers going forward to kind of be similar to this as we look beyond 2013. In terms of the characteristics of the buyers, as you might expect, the largest clients are the big five banks. So ICBC, ABC, Bank of China, CCB, and the Bank of Communications. Their share of the overall purchasing market, or of the overall market of ATMs that they purchased, is down a little bit in 2013, but still represents more than half the market. We're also seeing a lot of purchases from rural financial institutions. So as I mentioned before, there's a big push from the government to push into rural banking, kind of bank the unbanked, and inclusive financial inclusion, I should say. So we're seeing a lot more from ABC, the rural credit cooperatives, rural commercial banks, and postal savings banks, which represented about 45% of the market share in 2013. So they were purchasing about 45% of the ATMs in 2013. And more specifically within that segment, the rural credit cooperatives and rural commercial banks represented about 22%. So they were by far the largest ATM producer by segment. The main product that has been purchased over the past year is the cash recycling system. So this is a quasi-ATM. It's very similar to an ATM and contains all the functions of a regular ATM, but it also allows for cash recycling. So this basically allows you to deposit cash into the ATM and withdraw cash from the ATM. So this has a couple of advantages with it. First of all, the average consumer in China is much more used to this model. Depositing at the ATMs. So it's something that has started kind of right from the very beginning of ATMs here in China. And there's less maintenance that's required. So if you think about the install base of many of the large banks, and ICBC will have tens of thousands of ATMs around the world, the fact that the machine will take deposits and allow withdrawals is good to reduce the amount of maintenance that needs to happen and the cash that needs to be taken in and out of the machine to make sure that there's enough stock in the machine itself. When we look at the manufacturers, the top five players are GRG Banking Equipment Corporation, which is a local company, Hitachi, Shenzhen Yihua Computer, Diebold, and NCR. And so between them, they represent about 70% of the market share, with domestic GRG being the largest seller in the market with 23% in 2013. And they've actually led the market in China for the successive 6 years, so leading up to 2013. They're still the largest provider and supplier of ATMs in the market. And this is quite interesting, and we'll get into this a little bit more detail here, but the domestic technology manufacturers in China have struggled in the past. Oftentimes their value proposition or the kind of sophistication of the software or the hardware that they're offering hasn't been up to international standards. What we've seen in the past couple of years, both in the banking and capital market space, is that a lot of the product offerings are matching the needs of the consumers and getting close to being on par with what you would expect from an international solutions provider. So the maturity of some of these domestic providers is increasing greatly. That's also coupled with the fact that over the past month and a half, there's been a lot of comments from the regulators and from the government to favor domestic producers. So if you've been following the news, state-owned companies have been told to no longer use foreign providers of consulting services and are suggested to move away from providers like IBM. Now, if you think about IBM's mainframe business in China is huge. and represents full single digits of IBM's global revenue, so not insignificant. So the government is really starting to push under the auspices of protecting domestic security and security of IT systems, is moving away from international providers. So that could provide an advantage to some of these domestic providers going forward. The CRS, the cash recycling system, may determine the future competitive marketplace in China. This is largely because the domestic CRS manufacturers, GRG and Yihua, have strong research and development capability in this space, and they've been developing these systems for a number of years. More and more banks are installing CRSs rather than regular ATMs for the reasons that I mentioned before. It's less costly to install some of these machines, and it's to their advantage to lower the teller staff and to be able to better serve the customer in remote areas where there may not be full branches. Of the foreign vendors, Hitachi is really one of the few that had a focus on CRS from the very beginning. So they have a little bit more of a lead among the foreign ATM manufacturers in terms of what's coming to market. And as I mentioned before, the domestic ATM suppliers may replace the foreign peers in the market. So we're already seeing GRG lead the market. We may see that market share increase in the next couple of years as domestic SOEs and banks move away from foreign providers. Now, just very briefly on risk and opportunities, we wanted to highlight a few of these things. Within the ATM space, obviously a big concern for ATM manufacturers around the world is the end of the security update services for Windows XP as of April 8th of this year. And that's a big problem for the ATM industry, as 95% of ATMs are on Windows XP. Now, most of the ATM manufacturers have stopgap solutions in place, but it really kind of raises the question about what's going to happen in the future with the operating system that's installed on some of these ATMs. It's kind of a different case in China because the China ATMs only connect to the interbank network rather than the external. So it's relatively difficult to be attacked, but it doesn't mean that it's absolutely safe. So these all sit on kind of internal networks rather than any kind of external networks. In terms of solutions, some banks are going for Windows 7 for new ATMs. And for old ATMs, there are certain companies like Jiao2 Technology that has launched an XP Swole program to basically enhance ATM system security for XP. So basically to continue the support of XP. One unique point on this, though, is that the Chinese government has also told people to stay away from Windows as well. So in terms of what's going to be happening for the future of ATMs and the operating systems on that, that's going to be interesting in the next couple of years for sure to see which way the ATM industry goes. Perhaps they'll even launch their own homegrown iOS to go on to some of the ATM systems. Looking at future trends in the market, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but is quite common here in China, is ATM outsourcing services. So because the Chinese ATM market is the largest in the world and banks need to focus on their core business and need to control costs, many have outsourced some of their ATM services. So everything from ATM location selection, bank outlet construction, maintenance services, operations management, cash management, etc., is being provided by some of these external ATM kind of outsourced service providers. But these providers in China so far are relatively small and not terribly sophisticated as compared to what you might expect from a foreign outsourced service provider. So, we're seeing spots of growth from companies like GRG that also has a subsidiary that takes care of some of this outsourced services. But we expect this industry to be, or this space within the industry to be an area that's going to grow in the future because it's something that's definitely needed by the banks, especially as they move more into the rural parts of China. They're not going to want to be able to have to maintain all of those ATMs. So outsourcing it to an external provider would help them in that case. We talked a little bit about funds transfer before. This is something that China UnionPay is really promoting, using the ATM to transfer money from between the banks. So it's very popular among commercial banks and cardholders. CCB, as an example, the growth in cross-bank payment transaction volume via the ATM was 280% in 2013. So it's grown significantly, and that's a key functionality of a lot of the ATMs and the usage of the ATMs. In 2013, all of the large commercial banks, except for ABC and ICBC, have transfer fund services available, and I should say between banks, and ABC and ICBC will launch their cross-bank transfer service via the ATM in 2014. So that'll be a key opening up for them as well. We're also seeing the convergence of ATMs and mobile technology. So with ICBC ATMs, you can actually, with your mobile banking, you can program in your mobile number, and you can say, I'd like to withdraw 1,000 RMB, and then you can go to the ATM and essentially do a cardless withdrawal. So you go, you type in your mobile phone number, an SMS is sent to your phone. You type in the code that's within that SMS into the ATM, and you can withdraw the money. So it's a convenient way for sending money to other people or sending money to yourself when you don't necessarily have your card with you. And so we'll see more of that going forward, not just from the banks, but we could potentially see more integration between some of the third-party online payment providers as well. If you have a chance, listen to our third-party online payment webinar that we did earlier this year, and you can learn a little bit more about what some of those convergence factors are. One of the other trends that we're seeing here, and this is kind of a primitive version of it on the side here, is VTMs, or virtual teller machines. These are really starting to pick up in China. We're seeing a large increase in the VTM install base in 2013, and we're seeing a number of different banks getting into this space. Really, the feeling here is that VTMs will eventually replace traditional counter service. So they'll be providing, comprehensive financial services, foreign exchange, financial products, et cetera. And that is one of the goals of that is to save costs and increase the service that that the banks are providing to their customers. So if you picture what a VTM is, it's basically an ATM. It has all of the cash in, cash out functionality, but also has a video link to a customer service agent. So when you're there, you can actually go and you can talk to somebody face-to-face, and they can typically handle more complex financial queries, products, sales, and servicing. So in all likelihood, many of the banks will have the strategy of having, say, 1,000 VTMs spread out across the country, and then somewhere in a kind of a low-cost service area, like maybe a Chengdu or in the West, have a team of servicing agents that will then answer those calls as they come in. So if you think about the scale of this, it allows you, instead of having teller agents that maybe not be 100% occupied, it allows you to have a pool of agents that essentially similar to a call center, where you can service customer queries in a much more cost-effective way than they could in the past. So we've gone through kind of what's happening in the industry, looking at the buyers, the manufacturers, some of the risks and opportunities, some of the future trends that we expect in the ATM market going forward. Now taking a look at a couple of the conclusions that we can draw. There's space for growth in China's ATM market. When you look at penetration, either measured by number of ATMs per person or number of ATMs per bank card, there's sizable growth in getting China to the point of any of the Western countries. So, we're likely to see the install base increase in China. In terms of the buyer's market, the big five still dominate the ATM purchase market, but we're probably going to see more purchases come from rural financial institutions, which are being supported by the government push. So a lot of these rural banks are getting more of a push to get into the western parts of China, and we'll likely see that continue over the next couple of years, and that support from the government will help them fund ATM purchases. The other area that we don't mention here that might see growth, or that will see growth in 2014, is the private banks. So if you've been following the space, basically the central government has approved 5 partnerships of banks to be set up by companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Suning, Fosun, that will be set up over the course of 2014 and going into 2015. These companies, as they get their banking networks set up, although most of it will probably be online, they may have ATMs spread out across the country as well. So we may see more purchases coming from the private banks as well. ATMs manufacturers, as we mentioned before, the domestic ATM manufacturers are really dominating the market, and that will probably continue and expand as the Chinese government encourages banks to use domestic technology. And we have some commentary on the website looking at that, not just for the ATM market, but across the financial industry as a whole. VTM is the potential future. In any case, banks will be moving towards more intelligent ATMs. The consumers and the users of the clients of the banks are getting more sophisticated in terms of what they're looking for from the ATMs themselves. So as this continues, the functionality of the ATMs will likely increase. But a VTM is a good way for banks to help cut costs as well. So installing one VTM, you're able to service many more people with fewer staff than you would be able to previously. But there's lots of moving pieces in this. So we mentioned private banks before, online finance, online payments. These are all going to play a part in the ATM industry as we go forward in 2014 and in the future. So, in conclusion, the ATM manufacturers, especially the foreign ATM manufacturers, really have their work cut out for them going forward. The demands from the banks will become greater. The competitive challenges from domestic providers will be even greater as we move forward in 2014 and going forward. So I hope that gave you a bit of an overview of what is happening in the ATM market. Now I want to turn it back over to Paul and see if we have any questions.
Hi, Zenon. Thank you very much for that. Just a heads up, I know some of you have just told us that you may have had some issues there with the sound in the middle. It sort of went out for a little while, but it looks like we're back. In the meantime, while we did get some questions that came in from the audience, so let's just go to those, and then we'll work out how much the recording may have been missed there somewhere along the line. So, Zenon, the first question, this one comes from Jackie, and it says, are the trends to VTMs really sustainable, and what's driving that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We think they are. I think although the VTM unit itself is probably more expensive from a capital expenditure perspective, you're essentially shifting OPEX to CAPEX and decreasing the expenditures. So instead of having kind of this operational aspect where you have one branch with 5 different tellers, maybe now you have 2 tellers, and so you're decreasing your teller staff, but you have a VTM to help take care of that. So, sorry, I'm seeing that my voice is cutting in and out here as well, so I apologize for any audio issues. But yeah, we do see VTMs being sustainable going forward in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Zenon. Actually, you were fine there. It was just a little bit of a blip, so you're okay. So for those of you who are still with us today, feel free to send in your questions. I can see some more coming in on that question and answer panel as well, so feel free to send those in, and if we have time here today, we'll get through those too. Let's see. Next one, Zenon, comes from Rebecca. And Rebecca asks that the number of ATMs purchased by banks is different than the overall number of ATMs deployed. Why is that so different? And then you mentioned that the banks that were buying. Oh, sorry, that's not the that's the end of the other question. So yeah, so basically the overall number of ATMs deployed. Why is that so different?
Yeah, there is a gap between a couple of the years. There's a gap of about 20,000 where the number of purchased ATMs doesn't exactly match the number that are the install base, essentially the ones that are deployed. So we believe that banks at one point had overpurchased a little bit in terms of the ATMs over the course of the year. And so they were holding back on the purchases the next year. So it was kind of that in combination with the cost controls that accounted for that gap in that 1 year. But that's a good point. Yeah, we had noticed that in the analysis as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And sorry about that. I was reading ahead from one of the questions that's come in here from Grace, and Grace had asked the question. It said, you mentioned banks that were buying. Is there a list of buyers, or who is not buying?
Yeah, that's another good question. Pretty much everybody is buying because of the opportunity in the market and the fact that certain areas of China are still developing the banking infrastructure. There's pretty much the banks all around China are looking to purchase ATMs, both in terms of geographical dispersion and all of the segments of the banking industry. So yeah, there's still pretty much all of the banks are expanding their branch networks. They just might overall be purchasing less than they were in the past because some of the cities that we saw, like Beijing and Shanghai, are getting a little bit more saturated in terms of the actual number of ATMs there. So probably we're seeing a bit of a slowdown in terms of the purchasing coming from the larger banks, and that's shifting to more of the smaller banks that are newer and or targeting the kind of the rural markets.
Okay, thank you very much for that as well. Couple more that are coming in. I'll ask you one. It looks like Patrick's got a question here as well. It says, can you explain a little bit more about bank transfers on ATM? And he says, not sure I got that as well. And for me personally, I'm intrigued with that one too. So you're able to do some transfers between banks using an ATM. That's an interesting functionality that I haven't seen before.
Yeah, so basically the way it works is if you have the bank account of somebody else, you can go to the ATM and you can type that information in. You type it in, often you type it in twice to confirm it. And then it brings up the recipient's name, and you can actually transfer a significant amount of money. I pay my rent every month using this, so you using just the ATM, you can transfer to somebody else who has an account within that same bank. And then for most of the banks, with the exception of ABC and ICBC, you can transfer between banks as well. So in other words, if my landlord has his account at China Construction Bank and I have an account at Bank of China, instead of going to the teller or using online banking or mobile banking, I can just go to the ATM. I can type in his bank account number and then transfer the money to him just using the ATM. So in certain cases, that can be a little bit more convenient. So say if you just got your paycheck and for some reason you have your pay in cash, you'd be able to go to the ATM, go to a CRS, one of the cash recycling machines, deposit that money in, which would be credited to your account, and then transfer that money almost immediately to the destination account. So it is something that's very unique for China, but does get a lot of use with the ATMs here.
Okay, thank you very much. Great insight into that. It's amazing functionality. All right, well, look, I think we have time for just one more here, Zenon, before we close it off. This one comes from Akbar, and the question is, what protection from robbery is there? And I guess it's looking at how you protect those ATMs, and is there anything different with them from traditional ATMs, etc. So if you could have a shot at that one.
Not they have all of the kind of standard security that I would that ATMs would have in other markets. One of the things that's unique for some of the banks here is they'll have essentially a locking cabinet around the ATM. So in many cases, you kind of walk into this almost telephone booth style ATM space, and then you close the door behind you and lock it. Now, the banks kind of put that in. We don't know exactly what drove them to do that. And there might have been some robberies or assaults that happened around ATMs that kind of pushed them towards that. But really, in general, that kind of crime doesn't happen too much in China. So there hasn't been as much focus on that for ATMs. Far more prevalent is kind of phishing or online theft. Both in terms of identities or trying to trick somebody into sending money to a bank account. And oftentimes you'll get texts, kind of spam texts here that's saying, "Hi, this is your mother, your sister's had an accident. Please send money to this bank account," and no other details beyond that. And so, people wouldn't do it if people didn't fall for it. So there are some people that actually fall for those scams. But with actual physical assault, there's not much of that happens in China at this point.
Okay. Yep. Thank you very much for the answer. That's great news. All right. Well, look, we promised we'd try and keep this one as close as we could to the 30-minute mark. So I just realized we're a little bit over it as well. So with that in mind, I know we didn't get to some of the questions that we've been asked today. So if we didn't answer your question, as I mentioned to you earlier, we've been busy answering those in the background as well. But if we didn't answer your question individually, we'll get back to you via an email very shortly as well. As mentioned during the session by Zenon earlier, today's discussion was based on Kapronasia's upcoming report entitled ATMs in China 2014, which is an in-depth look at the opportunities and challenges in China's ATM market. And this will be available as part of Kapronasia's subscription service. So we're going to be putting up the recording and the slides. They're going to be available on the Kapronasia website as well. So if you haven't already registered for this valuable service, we'll be providing a link to do so in the email. So that way you'll be able to listen to the recording and be able to listen back to something if you may have missed it as well. You'll also be able to watch the presentation too. So that way, if you've missed anything, you'll be able to do so at your own pace. Now, once again, Kapronasia appreciates your time today and hopes you found the information informative and helpful. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for joining us.